Hey everyone, Ponyo here. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of After Dinner Mints. I highly encourage everyone watching to join us in the Art Blocks Discord. A link to our Discord can be found in the description of this video. As always, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode of our weekly show. And now I want to introduce our guests for this afternoon. First off, we have Executive Director of Blockchain Association, Kristin Smith. Next up, we have General Counsel at OpenSea, Gina Moon.
Hi.
And welcome, Gina. And finally, we have COO at ArtBlocks, Hugh Heslep.
Hey, Ponyo.
Welcome, everyone. So for everyone tuning in, today we are using a discussion format that we've used in the past where our guests will have a conversation with each other. Today's discussion will revolve around crypto policy. The group will be talking about crypto regulation and legislation. With that being said, Hugh, who will act as a guest moderator, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Ponyo. Well, welcome to the show, Kristin and Gina. Really excited to have you both.
It's great to be here.
It's really fantastic timing, actually, that we're talking about this. Kristin, we had started talking about maybe you coming on the show about a month ago, and at that time, we maybe had an infrastructure bill. I know so much has happened, right?
The world has changed.
It really has, and so maybe even the FTX stuff is about a week old, which in crypto time is quite a while. This is being recorded on November 21st, so. I guess why don't we just get started with FTX and get that out of the way? We have a whole bunch to talk about, and I guess we'll start with you, Kristin. Could you talk a little bit about how you anticipate the regulatory agencies are going to be looking at FTX, and have these events affected any of the current legislative environment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Hugh, and it's important to know that FTX had a very large presence in Washington. Not so much that they had a giant team in Washington, but that Sam Bankman-Fried himself spent a lot of time with regulators and lawmakers, educating them about crypto. And so I think for those of us in the crypto industry, the events have been a shock, but for those on the Hill, they knew him personally. And so I think they're feeling a sort of a sense of betrayal right now. But I think that, if you step back in the scheme of things, not a whole lot has really changed. I think that Congress is continuing to look at legislation to fill in some of the regulatory gaps in Washington. I think that, we're seeing a lot of activity in the courts, which we can get into later as well. All of that is still continuing. I do think, though, that we're going to see we already have 3 hearings that have been announced for the month of December in Congress looking at FTX. I think that you have the SEC, the CFTC, and DOJ that are all looking at different aspects of what happened. And so I think there's going to be a lot of focus on FTX specifically. I do think as sort of the broader sort of crypto industry, there's a lot of work that's going to be done because there are so many questions that are coming up. There's going to be a lot of education, particularly in the first quarter. But I think, I think it's fairly easy to explain that FTX is not the entire industry. Sam does not speak on behalf of the entire industry, and that the actions that they were doing at FTX are in a entirely different class. And so, we'll have a lot of work to do, but I think at the end of the day, we can still kind of come out on top, and the pathway is there to achieve good policy for NFTs and Web3 and crypto, and all of that good work is going to continue.
Yeah, it's definitely frustrating to see a lot of mainstream news outlets talk about this being an indictment of crypto, when really it just seems like regular old fraud where we have existing laws that
yeah, and it's interesting because this is a crime that is as old as financial services, right? Like, this isn't what real crypto is in terms of being able to transact on a peer-to-peer basis, to be able to hold your own digital assets. And so I think it does provide an opportunity to distinguish between, some of the different actors in the crypto space.
Well, Gina, has this impacted OpenSea at all?
Yeah, and
Could
before I hop in, I'll do my usual disclaimer. I think Kristin's in a little different of a spot as I am. She definitely speaks for the Blockchain Association, but I'm here just in my capacity as a human who loves NFTs. So I'm not speaking for OpenSea. I'm also not your lawyer to the extent that I talk about some legal stuff on the show. But yes, I think that what's interesting is it highlights that crypto isn't a monolith, as you probably heard a lot of people speak about. What happened here fundamentally was really classic, basic financial fraud, things that you see in the traditional finance sector. And it had nothing to do with crypto. Crypto wasn't something that enabled this. There was nothing specific there. And then when you think about NFTs and you think about companies like OpenSea in this space, or many other companies actually in the NFT space, a lot of that is based on the non-custodial sort of ecosystem. Like that's how NFTs really came up. A lot of people self-custody. There's some companies out there that do custody NFTs, but a lot do not. And that self-custody sort of regime actually would not have allowed for something like this to have occurred, what happened here with FTX. So I think that's actually a really important lesson, and something that despite all the negative that came out of it, it does illustrate, I think, to people that are puzzled by the concept of self-custody, of like why it is actually quite important. It's not for everyone, right? Like self-custody has its own issues. You put a lot on users, and users have to understand sort of security risks, et cetera. But I do think that this issue with FTX actually highlighted the value of ensuring that users still have that option to self-custody.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It really appears that the news that I've read, mainstream and then crypto Twitter, for the first time, or maybe not the first, I've seen a lot of the crypto Twitter news based on actual blockchain research in terms of Alameda. And it seems like those news sources have actually been based on some sort of facts, whereas elsewhere it's just been, fraud and putting a face of SBF up there. So we'll see how that all plays out. I'm very, very interested to see. I think that have I seen that the DOJ is starting to put together an investigation? Is that right, Kristin?
Yeah, my understanding is that's going on. Yes.
Okay. Well, I neglected to mention at the beginning that Kristin, the Blockchain Association just completed its inaugural policy summit in DC, where I attended, and I was greatly entertained and educated. When you last spoke, you just talked about, you threw out a few acronyms, SEC, you mentioned the CFTC, you mentioned the DOJ, not to mention there's OFAC and FinCEN and FATF and NCCT. Oh, there's so many acronyms out there that I took literally 2 pages of notes. Could you give us a little overview of the role of the SEC, the role of the CFTC, and then if NFTs specifically aren't viewed as either security or a commodity, what other regulatory agencies might have some sort of protection or regulation over NFTs?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. If the SEC is the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they oversee disclosures around specific securities, which is defined in law, and then also the exchanges of those securities. The CFTC is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and they oversee things like derivatives, swaps, and futures markets for commodities. The interesting thing about NFTs is, sort of where they might fall in all of this. I've heard some make cases that if you have some sort of like fractionalized NFT, that could potentially be captured under the securities laws. Commodities, sort of by their nature are fungible, not fungible. So we think that should not, the CFTC probably shouldn't come into play right now. But there is this broader debate going on with crypto policymakers as to, what should we do for regulating crypto spot markets? And sometimes that conversation extends to NFT marketplaces as well. There's no, sort of clear, federal regulator for those marketplaces. But this is something that could potentially get passed in law. And so it very well could end up being that the SEC or the CFTC does in the future play a more expanded role in terms of policing the marketplaces. I would also add there, you mentioned FinCEN, that's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This one's very important too, because if you get deemed to be a money services business, then you're required under the Bank Secrecy Act to know your customer, to collect information on them before allowing them to sort of participate in your service. So I think that's an important federal agency, and could potentially be important for the NFT marketplaces as well.
Well, Gina, you must have some personal opinions about what Kristin just said about marketplaces.
Yeah. So I think the one important thing to remember about NFTs is, at a foundational level, they're just a building block technology of Web3, right? So a lot of times when I think about how you regulate them, I think about just websites. So websites are fundamentally, their type of technology, if you want to call it that, or a web page. And essentially, the way you want to regulate a website will depend on what the website is, right? So if you want to, look at an online casino, for example, you could regulate that because of the features of that website. But ultimately, if you regulated every website as an online casino, you'd end up with a bad regulatory approach where you're over-regulating and under-regulating. So that's how we think about NFTs, because there are many types of NFTs and there's many ways to use NFTs. So to zoom out, what I like to think about is sort of just general tech regulation and consumer protection regulation, which does apply to everything in the world, including NFTs. And that's where you have what people call UDAP laws. So unfair, deceptive acts and practices laws. You have them at the federal level. So, the FTC has FTC Section 5 that they bring a lot of actions against a lot of companies in tech for unfair and deceptive practices, as well as you have state AGs, attorney general, who also bring these cases. And then there's also private rights of actions in certain states to bring these. And so at the foundational level, what those laws do is they're focused on the consumer. They're focused on users. So whether you're an NFT enthusiast, whether you're an NFT creator, whatever it may be, everybody sort of has rights under those laws to sort of fair and practices that aren't deceptive. So I think about that foundation because a lot of times people say NFTs aren't regulated. And I think that's not quite right, because there is that sort of body of law and enforcement that exists that has actually regulated tech for a very long time. Separately, then you have all the other kind of more specific regulators. So you have on the sanction side, OFAC, the sanctions laws apply to everybody. But then as Kristin was talking about, you have the securities regulator, the SEC, commodities regulator, CFTC, and then you have the money services business regulator. So at the federal level, that would be FinCEN. So all of those regulators will be interested in pockets of different things that could fall under certain definitions. And that's where the definitions for NFTs and other technologies in the space are really important. But if you meet certain criteria, you might fall under their jurisdiction. And that's the part, I think, that's sort of up in the air and sometimes creates a little bit of a lack of clarity for people building in a space of where does one regulator start and the other end? And do I have to comply with their sort of licensing regimes or disclosure requirements, et cetera? That was a long answer.
No, that's actually a perfect answer. It really begs the question to me. I think that Gary Gensler has maybe not come out and said that he believes that Bitcoin and maybe Ethereum could be a commodity. However, when you look at NFTs, I wonder if the term NFT or even ERC 721 protocol is appropriate and detailed enough to allow one of these regulatory agencies to have jurisdiction. So I guess another way of saying it is I could make a case for an NFT being a security, a commodity, or none of the above, just a piece of art or a collectible based on the use case. And so how are we, or how are the regulatory agencies going to ultimately work that out? Or will it have to go to litigation somehow, like the Howey test was created through litigation? I don't know if anyone wants to take.
Yeah, no, I mean, I
Kristin,
think, yeah, no, the policy, I think you make a good point here. There's multiple ways to make policy, and often federal agencies, just through rulemaking, can try to apply existing authority to something new. I think we've largely seen what agencies can do at this stage, and that, you know, if there is going to be any additional policy making, it's either going to have to be Congress that, you know, works on legislation, or we're going to see a situation where agencies potentially like overstep, and then this is ultimately something that's figured out via litigation. But I do think Gina made a really good point. Like, people often think, oh, there's this new thing and there's no regulation that exists. Like, that's just simply not true. There's you know, fraud is fraud in any space, and I think the bigger question is, are there unique risks that we're seeing, you know, with NFTs where we need to fill a gap? And I you know, I think that's an open question. I think, you know, policymakers have concerns when they see, you know, people paying millions of dollars for, you know, an NFT or something like that. They start thinking about money laundering and things of that nature. But, you know, in terms of, you know, it just depends on, I guess, sort of the type of NFT, and if there's a risk there that isn't addressed, then, you know, ideally we would have Congress step in and fill that gap.
What's your take on this, Gina?
Yeah, I have many takes, many thoughts. But I would say that the one thing I would think about, especially when we're thinking about new law in the space, is just making sure that what NFTs are, that's something that's understood, right? So a misunderstanding of the facts, a misunderstanding of a technology can oftentimes lead to bad results. And so with NFTs, one foundational difference with NFTs compared to fungible tokens or sort of traditional cryptocurrencies is that they almost always are associated with media and metadata, right? Like, that is what makes them exciting, is they're associated with artwork, they're associated with video or audio, and they have metadata built into the token that actually has sort of descriptive information or value. And I think that that's something that just fundamentally makes them different when you start thinking about some of the analysis under the regulatory regimes and how they should be treated. And then the other component, which is just in the name of them, is they're non-fungible, right? So fundamentally, you're talking about one item as opposed to a class of millions or billions of a fungible token. So I think because of those differences, a lot of the analysis on, you know, which regime should apply and how should they apply really differs. So when you think about sort of the securities regime, which is very disclosure based, and you zoom out and think about what the regulator is concerned about, at a high level, the securities laws are focused on information asymmetry between insiders. So sort of like normally, you know, historically corporate insiders and the general public, people that might be investors that might not have information. So they focus on sort of disclosure as a way to sort of fix that asymmetry. And so thinking about how would you apply that in a space that is like ours, where there's non-fungible items, you know, one of ones, for example, and then, you know, the nature of what those disclosures might look like, because, you know, you're not managing funds behind it, you know, like in the FTX case, you're not managing funds, you're not telling people how you're using those funds, whether you're rehypothecating them or whatnot. Instead, you're, you know, an artist perhaps selling your art. And so what would that look like? And so I think that's an important thing to think about in this space. And I you know, I'm not going to comment on whether or not, you know, certain projects, et cetera, should be regulated by the SEC, but I do think sometimes it's helpful for projects or for companies to think about, like, what is motivating and animating the regulators, and what do they really care about? You know, that's sort of what the SEC might be thinking about. You know, when you think about FinCEN, even if you aren't a money services business, thinking about the concerns around illicit finance in this ecosystem, and thinking about what you can do in this space to be proactive and try to further the space in terms of, maybe you're not required legally to do something, but maybe you could take initiative to figure out what that would look like in the blockchain ecosystem. I think that's really important for us to be doing.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, and, you know, Gina, we've talked about OFAC specifically, and you know, art blocks. We are a generative art platform, so what we put out, we believe, is art, and we've put a lot of time and effort into putting an OFAC compliance policy together, because there's this concept of a $10,000 limit, and for national security, one of the things that we've struggled with is when a Ethereum wallet address purchases an NFT, we don't know where that address resides. And so it lends itself to some idea, well, should we KYC? Should we not KYC? And what might that do to the entire ecosystem? Since, as you all both know, crypto is very much based on an ethos of self-sovereignty and decentralization. So it's been a very existential issue for us to have to work through. And we're doing our best to stay as decentralized as possible. So we've talked about, Kristin, when you kind of left off, you talked about legislation handling a lot of this. Just coming back from DC, I got the impression that it's possible that there may be some crypto legislation that could get pushed through this year. Otherwise, it feels as if 2023 may be a pretty big year for crypto legislation. Could you give us your thoughts on that? What might be coming up?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think 2023 is going to be the big year, really because we've had so many market events, including the FTX situation this year, that policymakers really, and lawmakers in particular, feel the need to step in and show some action in this space. We are in the lame duck right now. Obviously, we had the election a couple of weeks ago, and the current Congress is in place until January 3rd. There had been a couple things that were moving along. There's the Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act, which would have provided a spot market regulator for centralized exchanges, and also DeFi, which was a problem with that bill. That seems to be, sort of being set aside for now. There is some talk of stablecoin legislation getting done. It's funny, Congress would really love to have a crypto win. So even though the problems that we just saw with FTX have nothing to do with stablecoins, it's still being considered as a way for Congress to show action. And that's an issue that has been really talked about and debated since the launch of Libra back in 2019. I guess Libra never really got off the ground, but the announcement of Libra back in 2019. But we could still see some activity on the stablecoin front. And then there's always, we're just kind of keeping an eye out for sort of the random thing that we haven't anticipated yet, because, there's a lot of members that, at the end of a Congress, you have these sort of must-pass bills. It's very easy for things to get tacked onto those. And so, there may be some unknown idea out there that a member of Congress is pushing. And so we're trying to keep an eye out for that as well. But I'm actually a firm believer that at this stage, given that there's such intensity around crypto with the FTX fallout right now, that it's going to be better for the industry if we can delay this until next Congress. And I think that's probably going to be the case. I think most of the energy around crypto is going to be these hearings that I mentioned, where we've got both the House and the Senate that are looking at the FTX situation. And I think there's a good case to be made that we should learn from what happened with FTX before, pushing forward a solution. But the challenge we have with crypto generally is that this is a really complex issue. And Gina was kind of talking about education and needing policymakers to understand what it is they're dealing with. These are very busy people that are working on a lot of different issues, and not all of them have the time to really fully understand what they're doing. And so, we spent a lot of time at Blockchain Association, doing briefings, doing one-on-one meetings, and trying to fill that gap. But it's not one of those things you can just, have one 15-minute conversation and they fully understand. It really takes time to get that education across. And I think at this stage, given the year that we've had, our better policy outcomes legislatively will happen if we just give it a little bit more time for people to get up to speed and really grasp what it is, they're trying to legislate.
Boy, I have a few follow-up questions on that. So you use the concept tacked on. I very much got the impression that the infrastructure bill tacked on some digital assets component to it. And I may have gotten the impression that there's some efforts to walk that back. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So in the summer of 2021, the Congress was debating and working on infrastructure legislation to, help fund infrastructure projects. And what happened there is there was a piece of a piece of language that was, kind of last minute attached to this must pass bill that would require it gave the IRS authority to require brokers, which was defined in a very, very broad way, to do information reporting. This is one of those situations where if you're a company like Coinbase, as a consumer, it would be very nice at the end of the year to get a statement that shows what your tax liability is. Nobody's questioning that. The problem we had is that the broker definition was drafted in a very hasty manner, and it captured all sorts of entities, including I believe NFT marketplaces. It included things like miners and stakers, arguably software developers, because all of these parts of the ecosystem basically help effectuate the transaction. And so they were looped into this definition. There is an effort to tighten up that definition and to narrow that definition legislatively. There was an attempt to do this back at the time that the bill was being debated, but that fix wasn't put in there. But there has been some back and forth between the IRS and Congress on this issue that makes us think that that definition is going to be smaller and tighter. What's interesting, though, is that the IRS was supposed to do a rulemaking this past year to figure out exactly how different actors within the space would have to comply with this rule. And they haven't done that yet. And they've sort of run out of time in order to properly notice it. So we're anticipating that the IRS is going to delay probably another year before they move forward with this. But in the meantime, Congress does have, there's several bills both in the Senate and the House that aim to tighten up this definition. And so that is something particularly, and Senator Toomey spoke about this at our summit last week. He's leaving. He would love to get some sort of victory or win before he departs. And so this is on the list of things that he's going to be pushing to move forward.
And so with the infrastructure bill, when would that be enacted? When would that go into law?
It's been signed. Yeah, it's been signed into law. The original infrastructure bill has been signed into law. And so the question is, can they, the end of year package that must pass this year is a combination of the National Defense Authorization Act and the Omnibus, which is the big spending bill that helps fund the government through 2023. And so the thinking is that we could potentially get some changes that are added to that. So we should know sometime in December. But the December 16th is the day that the current authorization for funding the government runs out. And so, we may see some legislation mid-December that could act as a vehicle for some of these smaller fixes. We also want to make sure, though, that we also don't get more problems that are attached that we then have to undo later. So we're watching it very closely.
Well, Gina, I imagine you probably have some opinions on the infrastructure bill, and I'm also curious what other legislation you've been following.
Yeah, and so on that, actually, this is a place where NFTs, I think, are, and people's misunderstanding of NFTs or lack of clarity of them comes into play a little bit. There was a big debate about the broker definition and how expansive that was. But I think what sort of got lost was the digital asset definition in the actual infrastructure bill. The way that they defined digital assets was essentially something that is a representation of value. And actually, when you think about NFTs aren't representations of value the way that a cryptocurrency would be. They have value, but they're not representations of value. And so what's interesting is there's this question that actually a lot of people assume that NFT marketplaces, for example, would be encompassed by the bill, but our reading of it was that the definition actually excludes almost all NFTs unless you have an NFT that represents, for example, a currency. And so there was recently a draft 1040 that the IRS issued where they kind of included NFTs and said NFTs, were digital assets that were representations of value. And we actually, our OpenSea actually submitted a note just saying factually that's not actually what NFTs are, and it's not a correct understanding. And I think that is like a really important detail that we're looking to the rulemaking and sort of regulations coming out of the infra bill to explain whether or not there's going to be sort of an issue about the factual scope of that definition and what it covers. And then I think the chatter that I had heard was because of the delay in the rulemaking that the actual effective date for a lot of these things wouldn't be, obviously, and hopefully, knock on wood, January 1st, 2023, that it would instead be pushed out a year or so. But I think that's people are waiting very eagerly to see what happens there in terms of implementation timelines. And then in terms of other laws right now, I think that's, tax issues around NFTs are obviously very important. And I think foundationally, the industry has to do a good job of explaining NFTs and also explaining sort of the background technology, blockchain technology, that makes sort of issues around tax, like, it brings it into, I don't even know if I would say the 21st century or the 22nd century or whatever we want to say, but there's a lot of things within the blockchain ecosystem that tax regulators could actually leverage to think about calculating tax more accurately without having as much of a burden in terms of going to individual people and doing audits. And so that's something we're thinking about, how to communicate that well with people thinking about taxation in the NFT space that's new.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot at stake, and it can feel pretty scary on the NFT front because much of that is just semantics and definitional, and NFTs could get swept in with stable coins or could get swept in with other types of securities potentially. And one of the things that I have been talking to the Blockchain Association about and Gina's team about is the artists that have put out projects with Art Blocks. So Art Blocks has put out about 375 different projects. And the last count, we have 110 artists in the United States, scattered around 9 or 10 states. And I don't know how many congressional districts that are paying taxes. We're actually issuing the tax forms, that are hiring staff, creating jobs, and donating to charities. Last year, Art Blocks and our artists facilitated in our first year of business $58 million of charitable giving to 501(c) organizations. And in some ways, I feel like our role is to get that story out there. And Kristin, at the policy summit, no fewer than 2 of the congressmen that spoke talked about use cases, and we need use cases. We need to better understand it. And so this is kind of a calling out to all the artists who are watching this. I'll probably be reaching out to many of you to see if you're interested in reaching out to your local congresspeople. And I'll be talking to the Blockchain Association about maybe helping us facilitate some of those conversations, because I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, from my perspective, just with crypto generally, I've found that art NFTs, like digital collectibles, have been a really, really valuable tool in helping us educate Congress about crypto more broadly, because it really drives home this idea of digital scarcity, which for some reason, when we're dealing with Bitcoin or other digital assets, it's a little bit harder to get that concept across, but they understand the concept of a collectible. And so it's very easy to understand like a digital collectible. And yes, the fact that this is like empowering revenue streams for artists, and like it's just something that people are able to, like, members of Congress are really able to understand. And I think it's because it's visual in many senses, right? Like, because you can actually see something and you can understand the importance of that. So yeah, I think it's a great tool. And I think the fact that we have so many artists in the US that are doing this, like, they can make excellent advocates. And we're absolutely here to help facilitate making sure we get the right people talking to the right congressman.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to starting some of those conversations. Well, before we move on past the legislative front, I wanted to double click on the DCCPA. Kristin, you mentioned that may be on pause. I've read separately that they feel like it may be moving forward. My understanding is that is the policy that SBF was really working on and trying to help with. Is there any sense of I don't know, embarrassment may be too strong of a word, but the Congress people that SBF was working with, do they feel like they need to turn around or keep moving forward with this? Is that going to impact?
Yeah, no, our conversations with folks that are working on that bill within Capitol Hill, they want to they want to pause the brakes and take a fresh look at that legislation. So what the DCCPA does is it defines something called a digital commodity, and it gives the CFTC the authority to regulate what they call digital commodity platforms. And there are different types of 4 different types of digital commodity platforms. But the way that these definitions are written is they are very broad and end up capturing a lot of DeFi. And that's probably the biggest problem. But there's also other problems with the bill, and then it doesn't really define what is a security and what is a commodity in a way that's distinguishable. So, if that bill moves forward, I think there are a lot of changes that we would like to see to that legislation before it does happen. Sam Bankman-Fried was pushing this legislation very, very hard. I think I had a lot of clashes with him over the past few months because of this legislation and the fact that we were trying to change it. I do think there are sort of 2 schools of thought in crypto right now. One of them is, I think, probably what everyone listening, to this thinks. It's that, these are crypto are networks and NFTs and all digital assets. Like, this is a foundational technology that we can piece together to build services in a way that are better than the services we have today, right? So this could be new financial infrastructure, this could be new web infrastructure, but we're fundamentally trying to decentralize and democratize access to all of this information and to digital assets. Sam was sort of this mindset that he wanted to bring regulation in largely to put a moat around his own company, but also because regulation would bring more institutions in, which would make prices go up. Obviously, I would love to see prices go up too, but there was a very different sort of philosophical push. And so I think members of Congress feel very duped by the fact that he came in and spent all this time and was telling them this story of regulation. And I think that they're all kind of having a little moment of self-reflection, and they're stepping back away from, these efforts that were so clearly being pushed by him. Now they do still want to get legislation done. But I think they're, being a little bit more open-minded to taking a fresh look at it. Because I can't underscore how aggressive Sam was in Washington. I mean, I've never seen a CEO spend more time on Capitol Hill, lobbying policymakers. He was a major political donor. He donated about $40 million to candidates. And so he had an outsized presence that most executives don't have. And I think, for that reason alone, the bill is not going to be pushed through this year, and will probably reemerge in a new form, probably with a new name in the next Congress.
Yeah, just more continued uncertainty, and you kind of brushed on education, and I've been in crypto or adjacent to crypto since 2018, which is about 4 years, and I guess that's relatively long time. I have a hard time, and probably the first 2-3 years just focused on DeFi alone. How are legislators going to get up to speed quickly enough to really understand the nuance? I mean, both of you have talked about real nuances when you're talking about defining NFTs, defining ERC20s, or just other modular blockchains. What efforts are being made to just create an education platform?
I mean, I would say it's ongoing from our perspective. We're constantly doing meetings and trying to meet lawmakers where they're at, as well as regulators. You can't, come in and start, by talking about some DeFi issue or something, right? You have to start with the basics and move forward. But yeah, it's ongoing. I do say that the media coverage can be helpful because, people are getting more and more familiar with concepts and ideas just for reading the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times every day. So that piece is helpful. But I think really what's going to be the most helpful is when we have actual use cases where we can point to people who are, creating economic activity that are improving, the lives of individuals and making it easier to do business. Like it's the actual use cases that I think are ultimately going to pivot and get us to the point where we have good policy. And so as more and more of those start to come online and become real and kind of beyond the idea phase and the experimental phase, I think the easier the education is going to get.
Yeah, the use case concept feels like such a catch-22 though, because it's so ambiguous right now. It's hard to imagine putting a lot of risk capital out there for a business. It makes me think of Hester Peirce had made this recommendation we should form a safe harbor. Is there anything behind that? Have you seen any legislation that's even considered safe harbor?
I believe Patrick McHenry has introduced a bill that is based off of the safe harbor. Gina may correct me on that. But no, that is an idea that's out there. I don't think it's an idea that has a lot of legs politically at this point. Gary Gensler, who runs the SEC, opposes it, and some of the leadership of the Senate Banking Committee, which this would have to go. Legislation would have to go through that bill, are against the idea right now. But, it's one of those that I do think would provide a safe place for, new projects to develop in a way where there is some oversight. And so I haven't given up on that. I just think at the moment it's politically, not as heavy-handed a regulatory approach as I think some in Congress would like to see.
I see.
And Hugh, I think this is a place where like the listeners in particular to this podcast could really help a lot. Is I think foundationally a challenge for NFTs and crypto generally is that there isn't sort of a mainstream understanding of the value behind it, right? So prior to OpenSea, I worked at Facebook, and then I worked at Uber, sort of America's most loved companies. But when you think about those companies and you think about sort of like regulatory ire or policymaker concern, foundationally, at least, most of the regulators, most of the policymakers, and certainly the public understood the value of the technology or the product, right? So you could hate Uber so much, right? But you would understand the value that it would have for people to be able to get from a point A to point B in a way that they could never do before. And so I think the challenge for NFTs is people don't understand them, and they don't understand the value, and they don't understand, there's tons of interesting use cases in the future or that are here already in terms of ticketing and utility, but even just thinking about just digital art, right? Or new generative art, which Artbox is involved in. And how now, like if you're a collector, you can actually self-validate provenance for artwork, right? If you're a collector, you can also make sure that your money is going to the artist and that you can have continuing creator fees or royalties from that original sale. If you're a creator now, you actually own your artwork. You can transfer it without an intermediary, right? And you also have this choice of platforms, right? You could take your artwork and you could sell it across 7 different marketplaces, and no one can actually hold your work the way that a Web 2 company might. And I think that a lot of these kind of foundational issues that blockchain technology offers in a space that most people understand and appreciate, you can get into debates with some kind of purists about digital art and their just understanding of digital art in the first place. But I think just creators and collectors and kind of community members coming out and sharing, it doesn't have to be obviously directly with policymakers or regulators, but just sort of sharing why they are in the NFT space, why they enjoy them, why they think they're important. I think that is like a really foundational thing we need to do, because without that, then there's no cost to legislator or regulator sort of legislating or regulating something out of existence, right? Then they don't care if they drive all the businesses offshore and people can't, access NFTs in the same way. And so I think that is something that is like, we're still in the very early stages of education. And I think the value prop that we need to be able to explain to people is something that you can practice this Thanksgiving, when you're at home and trying to explain to relatives, like why you're in the space, why you love NFTs, why someone would possibly spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars on something. It's not all, money laundering or speculative investment. It's actually something super exciting. And like, that is up to all of us to make sure we're sharing, because if we don't, then it's just a zero cost thing for someone to come out hard against NFTs or the crypto ecosystem.
That's a great point, Gina. I appreciate you bringing that up. And to be clear, most NFTs aren't hundreds of thousands of dollars, at least on the art side. They're the ones we talk about a lot, but many of them are quite affordable. I actually have one more question on the legislative front. I learned a little bit about what they're doing in Europe last week with MiCA, and they have, I believe, not quite passed some legislation in Europe. Is that something, could you talk about that a little bit, Kristin, in terms of what precedents they're setting in Europe and what they are and are not addressing in there?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So MiCA, in some ways, MiCA is incredibly thoughtful in that it really does try to get all of the different players in the ecosystem defined and set up a framework for how they interact. That is in the phase right now where they're putting the details behind it, but the basic framework is there. I think one thing that's notable about that bill is like particular that DeFi is not included in that. There's a separate track for DeFi that they're going to take 4 years and they're going to study it. But a lot of what it does is it regulates, different participants in the crypto market, and then also, kind of puts forth, requirements around stable coins, et cetera. I think it's, probably a little bit heavier handed than we would have liked to have seen. But that being said, I think the fact that they're saving DeFi for later is a positive.
Thanks for that. It's I think it's positive that it seems like that might be the first crypto regulations actually put into law. I don't know anywhere else in the world, so hopefully we'll learn something from that. That's a nice segue here to talk about the idea of litigation. And earlier you talked about regulation by enforcement. Just to level set, could you explain that concept to the audience? What by enforcement means?
Yeah. Regulation by enforcement is essentially, we've seen a lot of this come out of the SEC, but also a little bit out of the CFTC. So the idea is what they do is instead of providing guidance or maybe conducting a rulemaking where there's an open process, what they do is they just go after and, bring lawsuits against companies for violating laws. And it's that, very sort of suit against an organization that ends up dictating the policy for the rest of the industry. And so what we're seeing has been a shift in the past couple of years where it used to be if you got a letter or the SEC, filed suit against you, you would probably just settle in an effort to not, to make it all sort of go away. What we're seeing now is companies are actually fighting back. So for example, Ripple, the SEC called XRP a security, and Ripple has spent probably $100 million so far defending that case. We're also seeing on the flip side, companies proactively suing the government. So Grayscale, for example, sued the SEC for failing to approve a Bitcoin ETF. So, it's important to remember, we do have a right to our day in court, and that there are often process arguments that can be used. There are different constitutional protections around, freedom of speech, writing code, or the Fourth Amendment, that you have to, have appropriate process before you can seize data and information. So I think that we have, it's interesting to see that the industry is sort of at this point where they're, not willing to put up with the regulation by enforcement and not willing to, just sort of acquiesce to whatever agencies, think their authority are. And so, I think we're going to continue to see more and more litigation. Ideally, we wouldn't do the litigation, right? We would just have clear policies on the front end. But, it takes a long time, particularly if you need Congress to come in and provide new authority so that agencies can have regulation. And so as a result, we're seeing a lot of litigation. And I think that that's a trend that's going to continue in the years ahead.
Gina, is there any litigation that you're paying special attention to right now? There are a couple of doozies out there.
Yeah, there are. I would say the one that I'm the most interested in right now is Freel v. Dapper Labs. So it's a case about the Top Shot NFTs from Dapper Labs and whether or not they're securities. It's a private class action, so this means it's brought by private plaintiffs, not a regulator, so it's not brought by the SEC. But you will have a federal court ruling on eventually whether or not the Top Shot NFTs are securities. And I think that will have implications for the space. Again, it's a very fact-specific analysis as to whether something's a security or not, largely also dependent on like what the NFT creators have said to sort of the buyers of the NFT, whether there's this expectation of profit element is super important. So the ruling in that case will not necessarily mean all NFTs are securities or all even of a certain type, but it's something to definitely keep an eye out on. It's been pending for a long time. I think when I started at OpenSea, it was already, it had already been around for a bit, and their motion to dismiss is still awaiting a ruling. So it's going to be some time. The civil side moves a bit slowly, but definitely keep an eye out on that. And then separately, it's not litigation, but seeing whether it goes to litigation, whether it goes to settlement, or whether it goes away, there was a leak that there was a Yuga Lab investigation by the SEC. And that is something I think that is obviously very concerning to the industry, because there's not a lot of clarity around, are they looking at, sort of Yuga's Bored Ape NFTs, just sort of straightforward PFP NFTs? Are they looking at their token? What is the SEC concerned about? And that's a place where these investigations, you won't hear sort of the outcome of them until they're over, right? Until there's a settlement or until there's actually a filed litigation by the SEC. So I'm very interested to see what happens, but not holding my breath in terms of how long it will take to find out.
Yeah, this is obviously just conjecture since I'm just hearing about this, but I've always been curious about the NFT projects that promise some sort of future utility down the road, and what kind of trouble that may or may not cause for them in the future. I, for one, have been, and I know certainly a bunch of people in our community have been monitoring this Tornado Cash issue, and it has some real ramifications in terms of, is code speech or not. I'm trying to, I've talked to a number of people in DC about this last week. It seems like the arguments against OFAC right now are, one, a free speech argument as well as a privacy argument. Is there any more to it than that, Kristin, in terms of opposition?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are some of the strong arguments. OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, they deal with implementing sanctions policy, and traditionally they have only been able to sanction persons. So that could mean like an actual individual or a company or entire nations. And so what we saw with Tornado Cash is that they actually sanctioned some smart contract addresses, which is a free speech issue because you should be able to write code, but it also is preventing a lot of perfectly law-abiding people who have perfectly law-abiding reasons to want to use the Tornado Cash mixer from doing so. And so there's very little process around this. I think the challenge is that OFAC does have a lot of authority, and when you're doing things under the umbrella of national security, courts in particular, like often, err on the side of going with, the national security argument. And so it'll be interesting. There's two lawsuits, one that Coin Center has put together, and another one that is funded by Coinbase. They're supporting a group of 6 people who are challenging that. And so I think this is one that's going to be incredibly important. But yeah, this is the first time that we've seen the government go specifically after, sort of smart contracts and software, and getting beyond, sort of their core mission. So I think they've clearly overstepped, but it's going to be interesting to see how this one plays out.
It feels like a slippery slope as well, because you could start at the smart contract level or the DApp level, and obviously the next level would be going at the protocol level to the Ethereum blockchain itself. And the idea of a sanction being built into a validator, for example, is certainly very threatening to a lot of people's reasons for being in decentralized finance in the first place. So very scary. for us. Well, we're running up against time really quickly here. I just wanted to see if there are any kind of follow-up or kind of closing points that you all wanted to make before we finish up here.
Yeah, I mean, listen, my closing thought is, this is a really interesting time for crypto policy, right? I mean, this is new. There's a lot of challenges around education. I do think, though, ultimately we're going to end up in a good spot. I think there is a lot of coordination. There's a lot of infrastructure in place to influence that policy, and the more and more we get people building and creating economic activity out of this, the better our odds are of getting good policy. And so, if we can be helpful in facilitating, getting you in front of your congressman, like we'd be happy to help do that, along with Hugh. And I think that, we're all going to be fine at the end of the day, because this is technology that can't be undone. We just have to, get the education done and bring thoughtful ideas to the table to address policymaker concerns. But, I'm confident that if we continue to work on it, that we will end up with good policy.
Gina, have any closing remarks for us?
Yeah, I would just say +1. I would say what's critically important is kind of what I talked about earlier, is just that policymakers and regulators and everyone, press, et cetera, understand the space. I think, all of us are here because we're very, very bullish about crypto in the long run, and me in particular about NFTs. And so I think that's just a really important thing that everyone should be doing right now, because I think there's a lot of decisions that will be made in the next year or two that will impact sort of the future of the space, particularly in the US, and whether it can thrive here. And so definitely important for you to explain to all your relatives, et cetera, on why NFTs, right? Why build in the Web3 ecosystem and not build in Web2? So I think that's something I'd encourage everybody to do.
Well, +1 on that. And all I can say is to both of you, thank you so much for joining. This was the perfect time to be talking about this. And Kristin, please let us know what other of us can do to help with that education. What you're doing is so important to so many people. So thank you very much for all the work you're putting in. And I know you're a very busy person, traveling all around the country, having to educate people on crypto. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, great to be here, and it's great to collaborate with you.
Well, over to you, Ponyo.
Great. Well, thank you so much to, the three of you for what you do, first off. And, I know this is really challenging work, but we appreciate what you do for, crypto regulation and legislation. Couple news and notes before we sign off. After Dinnerman's discussions are available as a podcast via Spotify, Apple, Google, and Amazon. And finally, we have a weekly newsletter that gets delivered once a week with information on upcoming releases and generative art related news. You can find a link to the newsletter in the description of this YouTube video. For everyone tuning in, make sure you comment, like, and subscribe to the Artplex YouTube channel. Be kind to each other, buy what you love, and we will see you all next time. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Cool.
All right, cool.